verbal agreement. The question is whether you want my head to be in the recording. I mean, I don't want to make any observations here, but it might need some adjustment from what is normal.
That is as high as it goes. I'm serious about that. We could put you under the table.
Are you familiar with tilting things?
No, I don't know how. I'm really technologically inept, actually. It's amazing that I got this thing on the stand.
You do what you can, right?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
It is such an honor and pleasure to be with all of you today. Thank you so much. It is just such a gift to go to different parishes and places all over the country and to be able to kind of walk in and feel like I've always been here, which is how I felt in the first service this morning. The liturgy, your reverence, the just wondrous, uplifting music. Thank you so much for being who you are and being a beacon of hope in a very dark and oftentimes very strange world. I want to talk with you about a couple different things this morning. And really, we're going to talk about mental illness. Mental illness is one of these topics that everyone has experience with, either directly or indirectly, themselves, family members, friends, extended relatives, across the board. And so it's one of these big, hairy topics that everyone kind of lives with, but nobody, it seems, really wants to think about or reflect on. Now, one of the great gifts that we have as Lutheran Christians is that I like to say that Lutherans really do our best work on earth. That is, where people really are living and suffering and rejoicing together as the body of Christ. And as Christians who find our feet firmly planted here on earth, that means that we should be ready to talk about even hard things like mental illness. And make no mistake, mental illness is really difficult to talk about. There is, even in our culture today, still a lot of stigma and shame that comes with mental illness. People of a certain generation might remember a movie like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and have that as their image of this is what mental illness is that you are sent off to I'll use the highly technical term, to a loony bin and kind of sequestered away where everyone else doesn't have to deal with you. Flash forward another 30 years and you're going to get Prozac Nation or something to that effect, where we kind of live and move and breathe in a world of medication, pharmacology. We deal with addictions that are both the big bad wolf addictions, but where addictions to things like pain medications are as real as heroin addiction, maybe even more so. And on top of all of this, and kind of through this, and just sort of thinking about how our culture has looked at mental illness over the years, is this kind of relentless sense of the unknown. That's what mental illness means. Now, my lens is as a pastor. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a counselor. I'm a pastor. So when I talk and use language about mental illness, it is kind of with an eye toward, when it comes to things medical, I am a layman. I am not the expert. What I am kind of an expert on, however, is suffering. And I'm going to guess you are too in some ways, because I have been a sufferer of mental illness for decades. In my case, clinical depression, but clinical depression and anxiety kind of go hand in hand. And that's sort of how I look at many of these things. But I also look at these things as a pastor, as someone who sees my people suffering, who recognizes the sometimes hopelessness that comes with these weird diagnoses and words and things that we're uncertain about, and recognize I just want to take care of my kids. I just want my parents to be okay, my siblings to be okay, my friends to be okay. What do I do when my son comes home from school and says that his 14-year-old friend killed himself? How do I answer that as a father and mother? Well, that's kind of my lens, is trying to think about those questions as a pastor. So to really kind of start, I want to tell you two stories. First of all, a little bit of my own story and how that story in darkness kind of came about. But then also what I'll call a pastoral care story from my congregation where I'm a member. Story number one. Story number one requires coffee first, however. Really, most stories require coffee. In 2006, I was serving as a pastor at Messiah Lutheran Church in Kenosha, Wisconsin. So southeast Wisconsin, kind of right on Lake Michigan, right on the Illinois border there. Wisconsin didn't like us because we were too close to Chicago. Chicago didn't like us because we were on the wrong side of the border. So we had half Cubs fans, half Brewers fans, a few Cardinals fans, a lot of Packers fans, and a few very quiet Bears fans. And to the best of my knowledge, no Lions fans. Sorry. So 2006, I was on partial disability for severe clinical depression. I had gone through a series of traumas and events that kind of got me to the point where I was not functioning as a pastor, as a husband, as a father, and doing simple things like brushing the teeth took about 2 hours. Really hard to be a pastor when it takes 2 hours to brush your teeth. And at that point in time, I was on partial disability. And if you don't know this, partial disability is a really, really dumb idea. Because what partial disability means is that disability becomes another job for you to do, another task on your endless checklist of things that you need in order to get somewhere or do something. But that's where I was. And I was spinning the plates like the circus lady, seeing how many plates I could spin all at once, and got a phone call from our insurance company on Good Friday morning. Now, most of you probably know that insurance companies never call you with good news. It does not happen. That's not their job. Now, the very nice lady thought she was telling me good news. She had called to tell me that they had determined that I was no longer sick and that therefore I had been taken off of disability. And I remember quite vividly the really ridiculously cheerful lady saying to me, "Oh, I actually see you've been off disability for 2 weeks. Congratulations." Now, this was not based on any diagnosis. This wasn't based on a doctor. This wasn't based on anything measurable. It was something about an actuarial table and the length of time and how they found that if they took people off of partial disability at X number of weeks, that most of them did fine. So, chink, welcome to modern medicine. And in that moment, I went from being the lady trying to keep all the plates spinning to watching everything crash and fall all around me. We had a month-old child. It was Good Friday. And I went from spinning the plates to planning my death on a bridge for later that day. Just like that. And I didn't tell my wife. I didn't tell anybody. I simply went from ideation to intent. Just like that. But I had a problem, and the problem is that pastors usually have to work on Good Friday. And so I had to go work, which is to say I had to go to church and do a service and preach and kind of do all of this pastor stuff for a while. So I went to our service. We had a joint service with a neighboring parish. And we were doing a noon service, and so I went and got dressed and kind of did all the things. As we're about to walk in, I tell my friend, the pastor there, literally as we are walking in, I tell him, "By the way, after we're done, I'm going to go kill myself." And then I walked in. I'm sure that was the single meanest thing I have ever done in my life. I have reflected many times on what was he thinking through this whole service that we're doing together, kind of going through all the motions, doing all the Good Friday things, and him kind of wondering, well, I wonder what's going to happen after church. But I was on autopilot at best. So we went through church. I found myself strangely preaching on the death of our Lord Jesus Christ for the salvation of the world while planning my own death. Being a pastor is weird sometimes, but that was weird even for pastors. And my friend, his name is John, my friend John did, after the service, the single smartest thing that he'd ever done in his life. What do you think he did? He didn't let me out of his sight. He was on me like glue. And we were stuck together. There was no getting away for Peppercorn. It was very frustrating. But his, let's call it holy persistence, but his holy persistence really saved my life. And as you can imagine, there is a lot more to that story. I obviously didn't die. You probably figured that out by now. But a part of what kind of came from that was a slow realization that this was not going to get better by myself. It wasn't just something on a task list, and that something serious had to change in order to get there. Now later on, I kind of learned that the synapses in my brain are not firing right, that my capacity to process input had been interrupted. And so things that would be quite normal for any human being now become impossible. Things like light or sound or people or decisions. It's hard to realize it, but you can actually get executive fatigue, that is decision-making fatigue, from figuring out that you need to brush your teeth. But when your capacity is this big, every decision is a torture. And that is mental illness. Certainly depression. The problem is that with mental illness, you don't have a big flag that you're waving around that says, I have clinical depression. I'm not using crutches. I'm not in a wheelchair. I don't have a big cast on my brain, although I kind of like that idea. Nobody can see it. Nobody knows. All they see and know is that something's not right. A lot of times people with depression really just look lazy because they can't make decisions, they can't do anything, and so they lose their jobs, and they have money problems, and they have problems with things like filling out paperwork. You know, like if you were trying to go on disability, for example. And so there are all of these things kind of swirling around that to many are just kind of one more thing in life. But to someone who's suffering from depression, it becomes almost an impossible hurdle. And that's just one lens. But we could use another lens and say anxiety. Or we could look at another lens and say some kind of a personality disorder. There are lots of different lenses, and each one is unique, but they do have some commonalities. And the commonalities are that something that is normal is interrupted. Behaviors and relationships are either strained or maybe even broken. And that kind of brings me to my second story, which is, how does a congregation kind of fit into this wild and wacky world? Years ago, before we moved to Wisconsin, we were members at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Fort Wayne, Indiana, one of the mother churches of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. Great big church, beautiful church, seats 1,200 people, all this fun stuff. Has, among other things, a giant wraparound balcony. So there's 2 levels to the whole thing. It's beautiful. Come visit us sometime. We're members there again now. And I remember an evening service where one of our pastors is preaching, and we had one of those kind of, I'll say, old style pulpits that's, raised up so it's almost level with the second floor. I've always liked how those pulpits actually kind of look like a chalice. Have you ever noticed that? It's actually not an accident. It's really cool. Lutherans come up with cool ideas sometimes. So he's in his chalice pulpit, and he's preaching an Advent service. And someone has come in from the street. Our church is from downtown, so we a lot of times get all sorts of interesting people coming and visiting. And someone had come in to visit and was sitting up in the balcony. So if you can imagine, the pastor is kind of up 10 feet, 12 feet off the ground, and he's preaching. And then there's somebody else that's on the balcony, kind of eye level with him, but over the whole congregation. And he starts to have a conversation with Pastor Hamer. He starts answering every rhetorical question that the pastor asks. You know how pastors ask these kind of questions that you aren't really supposed to answer? Well, he is answering all of the you're not really supposed to answer questions. And his social cues are a little bit off. He doesn't understand that this probably isn't meant to be a conversation, a two-way talk between him and the pastor who's preaching to 178 people or whatever. So what do you think happens at this point? Well, being good Lutherans, we like order. And people do not talk to our pastor when he is preaching. And so the ushers go into what I will call full defense mode. and they start to triangulate this gentleman, and he kind of sees them coming. And so he's kind of having this conversation, but he's moving away from it. It's like this guy's done this before. And so the poor ushers are trying to figure out, this is embarrassing. What are we going to do? This is terrible. We're St. Paul's. The world's going to end if somebody thinks that we're human beings. Eventually, they kind of corner him, and it moves on. But I have thought about that moment for many, many years. Because the man was not doing anything wrong. He was, let's say, wounded in some way. I don't know what his diagnosis was, if he was having some kind of a psychotic break or something else. I don't know. I'm not a doctor. But clearly his capacity to recognize that this was not a real conversation that he was having with my pastor was he missed it. And so the congregation is trying to figure out, all right, how do we actually care for this man, treat him with dignity and kindness, but also try to figure out how we're going to actually have church at the same time. And maybe you could imagine scenarios not unlike that. That's kind of oftentimes where congregations come in to mental illness, in my experience, is that the pastor, the deaconess, the teachers, they all deal with mental illness all the time. I guarantee you. This is a part of their daily bread in caring for people. And they muddle through it with wisdom and charity as best they can, as do we all. But a lot of times it doesn't really kind of bubble up to the congregational level. Do you understand what I mean there? It doesn't become that kind of public thing. Because at that point, the public thing, we as Christian congregations have a bunch of different competing things. And one is, I like to know what's going on, especially when I go to church. And I don't like uncertainty. And mental illness, by nature, brings chaos and unpredictability. And chaos and unpredictability makes all of us uncomfortable. Because I want to be able to sit in my spot. And if this person doesn't have good social cues, they might sit in my spot. Can you imagine the horror of what would happen if someone sat in your spot? I once had a lady, I told this story with our youth yesterday. I once had a lady in my church in Wisconsin. Marge Sheridan was her name. I buried her the night before our oldest daughter was baptized, so I remember this quite vividly. Marge Sheridan, and she was one of the charter members. She had probably hand sanded the pew where she sat when it was put in 1962. This was her spot. Up until the Sunday when it wasn't her spot. When some visitor came in and deigned to sit in the holy seat of Marge. And Marge is walking down the aisle, talking to somebody else, slips into her pew, and sits right in their lap. I think you can imagine something like that happening. Because that's kind of how we all are with certain things. Well, with mental illness, sometimes you may end up sitting in somebody's lap. And so now you, as a parishioner, and y'all, as a congregation, have a decision to make. Do I get mad at the nice person who is sitting in my sacred spot? How do I show hospitality for them and scoot them over so I can have my spot? How do I figure out how to actually show love and charity towards these people, recognizing that these people, or those people, are really us? That there is no difference, that chances are 10 to 20% of the people in this room right now suffer with some kind of mental illness, or will do so at some point in the near future. Because that's life in 21st century America. This is who we are, is we live in an overstimulated world. And I feel sometimes like we are just barely even beginning to grasp the degree that that stimulation is doing to us. So this is who we are, is in this world where we are all broken vessels in some way or another, and we need the healing of Christ. We need Christ, much like our gospel this morning, to not care who's looking carefully and to actually heal the guy with dropsy, even if it didn't seem like it was the socially right thing to do. A part of what I've tried to think about with this, and Pastor, you can tell me if I'm a heretic on this, okay? A part of what I've tried to recognize is that the divine service, which we engage in every Sunday, is not a performance in the sense that I have to perfect it in order for it to work. Now, it is work for some people. Your Sabbath rest means somebody else is working, often. But it's not a performance in that way. It is a gift. It is closer to that Thanksgiving dinner with Grandma, where you want to do it well, and you want to do it the way Grandma wants it, because, well, she's Grandma. And it's not a performance. It is a family. It's a family gathering. And we rejoice, and we hear stories and teaching, and we eat and we drink together. But it's not really a performance in that way. And so if the performance gets interrupted by someone answering a rhetorical question that the pastor asks. It's not like you have to back up and start over. It just means that maybe the story has taken a turn that you didn't expect was coming. But that Christ is still present, God's gifts are still there. In fact, this is an opportunity for you as the people of God to be Christ to all of those around you at that time, which I think is really cool. But that does kind of force me to not, to not cling so tightly that I forget that we're dealing with the most sacred thing of all, and that is the people whom Christ died for. Because you are the sacred gift that Christ gives to this community. And you're fed, and you rejoice, and you go out, and you are Christ in the world, which is really awesome. And sometimes a little peculiar, which is okay. So that's kind of my high-level approach to how should we as a congregation think about mental illness and the church. Now let's talk about some real concrete things for a minute that we might do to help those who are suffering in our midst. And it may be a parishioner, it may be a visitor, you never know. And most times you're not going to know who's suffering. Pastor might know. He might not, but he might know because you have a good pastor and he pays attention to you. So a part of that means is just think about your space. Think about getting in and out of that space for a minute, okay? And imagine with me, what's it like for someone who is uncomfortable and maybe ashamed a little bit to be there? What's it like for them to come into your space? Can they get in and out and be comfortable? Or are they going to feel like they have to parade all the way down to the front to sit at the anxious bench because there are no other seats available, or wherever it might be? So part of that means maybe thinking about having visitor seating scattered around the church a little bit. I know that's crazy talk. It's okay, I'm going to leave in a couple hours, and then you can go back and you can have a support session with Pastor. It's okay, I promise. But just thinking about, are these people able to get in and out comfortably? Because for me, when I am in the middle of my depressive moods, when I am in the kind of, let's say, in the darkness the most, what do you think the hardest thing for me is about Sunday morning? Just guess. And this is not a rhetorical question, I'm actually asking you. What do you think is the hardest thing for me when I am in that depressive mode? Shaking everybody's hand after church. And I simultaneously love it and dread it. And it is not because I don't want to see you. It's because every conversation is packed with meaning. And this may be my only interaction that I have with you for the week. And I want it to count. And so they all take a lot of energy. Now, I freely admit, I'm somewhat of an introvert. And so that may take more energy from me than it does from other people. But for me, it is that kind of onslaught of random conversations that is overwhelming. For someone who suffers from anxiety, I can almost guarantee that is the same. And so one of the things that I I tell people who suffer from anxiety, when they go to church, come late, leave early. I give you permission. It's okay. You know, lightning will not strike you. The pastor's not going to call you down. Come late and leave early. The people would love to be able to talk with you, but it's more important that Jesus talk with you. And so if all you can handle for right then is the come late, leave early, great. We're glad you're there. Maybe it'll be different someday. Maybe not. Who knows? I actually give that same advice to families with small children. I don't know if you know this, but church is the only place that small children ever are expected to sit still for an hour. It's kind of insane. And so especially for the more active of children, which always meant peppercorn children, I might add, especially for the most active of children, okay, today we're going to get up to the Kyrie, and then we're going to go out, and you're going to run around for a little while, and then you're going to come back a little bit so I can go to communion, and then we're going to go out again. And that's okay. Remember, it's not a performance. You don't get extra points for being there for the whole time. This is God's gift to you. And let that gift be the gift and not turn into an impossible burden. That's my advice. And you may take that as you see fit. So you have letting people get in and out, time, and come late, leave early. Some other obvious things might be, make sure throughout the service that there is somebody there that can actually give them a bulletin, show them where the bathroom is, do all of the hospitality things. And that may mean, and I don't know your church well enough to answer this, that may mean teaching the ushers to be friendly. Some ushers are a little bit more concerned about good order than good hospitality. Now, it takes both kinds, because otherwise you end up with complete chaos. But you do need someone or someones that are looking out for the lost ones, that are looking out for those who need help finding where they are, finding the bathroom, whatever it might be. And that might mean having somebody whose job it is simply to look for them. And maybe that means rotating, you know. It's going to vary from place to place. But above all, I think that means thinking about why people are there. And that they're there to be fed. They're not there to do something else. And that kind of gets us to the next part, and that is recognize that sometimes people simply need solitude. And that solitude, Jesus needed solitude sometime. I think if it's okay for Jesus, it's okay for us. And that solitude is all right. And here's my example of this, and this is probably where I'll get in trouble. Maybe not. We'll find out. One of the things that is exceedingly common in Lutheran churches is to have people be ushered out. Do you usher people out here? Yeah. And that fits my German Achtungness. I like it. What if I want to pray? What if I actually do want to talk to the person next to me? Why do we usher people out? Maybe it would be okay just to let people be for a time. I don't know. It's just a thought. I'll let you guys debate that in your next voters meeting. So I have just kind of given you a few kind of very some examples and what I hope is a way of thinking about mental illness in the church and recognizing that the church is a gift to the people around them, and that people, even when people are being lively and unpredictable, whether it is a 2-year-old or a 42-year-old with schizophrenia or whatever it is, that these people are the ones for whom Christ died. And that may mean that the performance isn't quite right. Sometimes the pastor has to compete with the 2-year-old during the sermon. Oftentimes the cantor does, right? And so that's all kind of a part of being the body of Christ, is recognizing these things and learning together and actually having the conversation. Now, I have been up here babbling for 45 minutes or so, and I realize that pastor is looking at his watch and is starting to get a little antsy. So I realize we don't have too much time, but does anyone have any questions or comments that I can try to answer at this point? Wow, you have them well trained, Pastor. He's standing over there hovering. He's got a schedule to keep. I better not ask any questions. Well, God bless you all. Thank you so much for your hospitality this weekend. It has been a real treasure and a gift. And if there are any questions or anything else that I can try to answer, you can certainly go to the seminary webpage, ctsfw.edu, and you can probably hunt around and find me. You can certainly contact Pastor Swem, and he'll forward any questions or whatever to me. And it will be well. God bless you all. Thank you.